In January of 1925, near trash containers on Vilonovskaya Street in the center of Samara, someone discovered buckwheat groats scattered near the bins and inside plastic bags. At first, it looked like ordinary food waste. Only later would it be revealed that these bags contained the remains of the former mayor of Samara, Viktor Tarkov, and his wife Natalia. The garbage truck arrived on schedule, collected everything, and took it to the Preobrazhenko landfill. Neither neighbors nor janitors suspected a thing. It was an ordinary winter morning. A young woman had carefully distributed the bags across various locations, and this meticulousness would later become a key detail in the case. A decade in petrochemistry, then politics. He was a man known by all of Samara. As the investigation would later establish, this was done by their own granddaughter, 29-year-old Ekaterina Tarkova-Belskaya. They had raised her from an early age, renting an apartment for her in the city center and covering all her expenses. To understand how the family of a former mayor reached such a point, we must start from the very beginning. Before entering politics, Viktor Tarkov followed a path still remembered in Samara. He started as an engineer at the Syntez Spurt plant. Back when the city was still called Kuibyshev, he rose to a leadership position, later becoming the general director of the Novokuibishevsk refinery, part of the Yukos structure and the Alliance Group. In 1990, he was elected chairman of the Kuibyshev Regional Executive Committee. It was he who initiated the process that returned the city's historical name. On January 25, 1991, Kuibyshev became Samara once again. In 2006, Tarkov ran for mayor, winning in the first round with 56% of the vote. He led the city of 1 million for 4 years. In 2010, he lost to Dmitry Ozerov and subsequently stepped into the shadows. By the end of 1924, he was 76. A pensioner, but certainly not one struggling for money. He owned an apartment in an elite building on Vilonovskaya and another in the Twins business class complex, 172 square meters. There were 2 cottages in the Moscow region, a stake in the Novitrek Environmental Company, and a collection of icons. As family acquaintances would later clarify, it wasn't a collection in the traditional sense, but rather a small home chapel. His wife was deeply religious. Those who knew the family said the same thing about her, a gentle, kind person who dearly loved her daughter and granddaughter. At that time, no one could have imagined how it would all end. For the last few years, the Tarkovs lived abroad. Some reports say Finland, others Norway. They returned to Samara shortly before the end of 1924 and lived quietly. Neighbors on Vilonovskaya would later say they hadn't seen him or her in the courtyard for a long time. Natalia Ivanovna rarely appeared in public, even when her husband led the city. Few Samara residents knew what she looked like. On December 20th, Natalia Ivanovna and her granddaughter Katya visited a friend who sold fashionable clothing through catalogs. It was a normal visit. The grandmother was picking out beautiful items for her granddaughter, doing so with great pleasure. The friend would later recall that specific day because at that moment she was choosing outfits for the person who, 10 days later, would be responsible for her passing. On December 27th, the friend called Natalia to ask if she was coming to pick up the order. She replied, "I'll stop by in a few days." But she never arrived. As investigators would later determine, this was the last confirmed conversation with Natalia Tarkova while she was still alive. On December 31st, a surveillance camera in the Vilonovskaya entrance recorded the elderly couple entering in the afternoon. Viktor and Natalia Tarkov entered their home. They never came out. Sometime between December 27th and early January, a fatal incident occurred in that apartment. No shots, no screams. Neighbors heard nothing. On January 3rd, Tarkov turned 77. Friends called to congratulate him. The phone was silent. But then messages began to arrive from his number. The text seemed to be from Viktor. "Feeling a bit ill? Left for Moscow on family business. Contact me through Katya." Those who had known Tarkov for decades immediately felt something was wrong, but formally, the messages came from his number, and for a while, it could be attributed to age or circumstances. Meanwhile, Belskaya was constructing a cover story for everyone around her. To neighbors asking about Viktor Alexandrovich, she was evasive or ignored the questions. To acquaintances, she explained that her grandmother had suffered a stroke and her grandfather had taken her for treatment. She arrived at her grandfather's company, Novatrek, with powers of attorney and documents, announcing to employees that her grandfather was in the hospital and had personally entrusted her with his affairs. The signatures on the papers seemed suspicious, but she insisted everything was fine. And here is a detail that would later disturb even the investigators. Throughout January, the Tarkovs' phones remained active. Messages were sent from them to friends and acquaintances, and as the investigation would later establish, Victor and Natalia even appeared to be messaging each other. Two phones, both in the granddaughter's hands, were sending texts to create the illusion that both were alive and communicating. This performance lasted over a month. Every day brought new messages and familiar phrases from people who were already gone. On January 31st, Alexander Kuznetsov, Tarkov's former deputy mayor, went to the police. He had known Victor for over 30 years and didn't believe a single one of those messages. Neither the words, the tone, nor the logic of the texts matched the man he knew. He filed a report regarding the disappearance. From that moment, the story entered a completely different phase. On February 3rd, the investigative committee opened a criminal case under a serious statute involving two individuals. It wasn't just a quote 5 case. The terminology was far more severe. On February 5th, police arrived at Belskaya's door. She refused to open it for nearly 5 hours. About 25 officers gathered at the entrance. The concierge, brought in as a witness, would later recall that the investigators made one request: "Just call your grandfather and grandmother and we'll leave. Just call so we can be sure they are alive." Belskaya replied that the phone wasn't working, then that it had no charge. That same day, the court detained her for 2 months. During a search of the apartment, investigators found Victor and Natalia's passports and both their mobile phones, the ones from which messages had been sent for an entire month. Belskaya refused to testify. During the court hearing via video link from the detention center, she sat in a shapeless puffer jacket, her hair in a bun, eyes downcast, giving one-word answers. At one point, she began asking which hearing she was even participating in. The head of the investigative committee, Bastrikin, requested a personal report on the case. The information reached the federal level. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from the entrance and the courtyard on Vilanovskaya. Everything was visible there. Starting from the first days of January, Belskaya entered and exited the Tarkov apartment multiple times. Every hour she carried something: black plastic bags, satchels. One recording shows her dragging a 100-liter plastic drum wrapped in black film into the building. Another shows a stuffed black bag being carried out. She would call a taxi, load the bags, and go to trash containers. Not the same ones, but different bins in various courtyards. Containers near the house on Vilanovskaya. Containers in a courtyard on Sadovaya. She would return and repeat the process. The taxi drivers had no idea they were transporting remains. On January 5th, an eyewitness noticed her discarding full trash bags. They remembered it, but didn't think much of it at the time. The investigative committee would later publish these frames. The camera quality is typical for an apartment entrance, grainy imagery, and it shows a young woman in winter clothing, businesslikely, carrying bags across the courtyard containing what was left of her grandmother and grandfather. No rush, as if she were taking out trash after a renovation. Simultaneously, the investigation reconstructed a chain of purchases, and it was a long one. Even before the Tarkovs stopped responding, Belskaya had begun shopping. On marketplaces and in stores, she purchased an electric reciprocating saw, plastic drums, canisters of lye, plastic bags, and gloves. All the sales points where she placed orders later confirmed the purchases, but the most important item was liquid nitrogen, at least 170 liters in 3 batches, all from the same store on Aurora Street in Samara. She bought the first batch of 30 liters on January 3rd, her grandfather's birthday. She explained to the sellers it was for a New Year's show. Journalists later tracked down that seller, who confirmed, "A young woman, nothing suspicious, an ordinary order." Liquid nitrogen is indeed often used for smoke effects at parties. Therefore, no one asked unnecessary questions. It is vital to understand the nature of this substance. At -196 degrees Celsius, human tissue becomes extremely brittle. This allows for the remains to be processed without resistance. As the investigation would later establish, the purchases were escalating. First chemicals and containers, then the tool, then the nitrogen. This did not look like an act of passion. It looked like preparation. Investigators entered the Vilonovskaya apartment, and at first glance, everything looked clean. Too clean. The entire premises had been treated with a lye solution. Furniture had been partially removed. Belskaya had disposed of items that might have held evidence. But she didn't get rid of everything. Forensic experts worked in stages. In the bathroom, using test strips, they discovered traces of biological fluids, then fragments of vascular tissue. The biological material belonged to Viktor and Natalia Tarkov. Then came the room. What investigator Denis Pronyushkin found there would later be described in Eduard Petrov's report on __8_minute fragments of human tissue were on the ceiling, the walls, the furniture that hadn't been removed, on the bookshelves, and on the books themselves. These were the results of using the electric tool on the frozen remains. When frozen tissue is processed, fragments scatter like shrapnel in all directions. The lye couldn't hide it. Belskaya tried to clean the apartment, but destroying every microscopic particle proved impossible. Experts found biological material in places where a person wouldn't even think to look. After this, the third stage began. The frozen fragments had to be turned into something that neither a passerby nor a trash collector would recognize. According to some reports, the remains were further processed and mixed with buckwheat groats. When these details became public, experts were divided. A forensic medical examiner stated plainly to journalists that processing such a volume with an ordinary household device would be impossible. A professional industrial unit would be required. However, food technologist Danila Elementov explained the logic differently. If the tissue is pre-frozen with nitrogen to a brittle state where cells and structure are compromised, a household appliance might suffice. The groats in this case acted as an absorbent, soaking up fluids as the frozen mass thawed. The resulting mixture was packed into plastic bags. Along with the remains, everything else was thrown into the trash bins: canisters, gloves, clothing, and tools. Senior investigator Inna Ivanova later called this not a classic crime, not because the method was unusual, but because there was almost nothing to find, not a single fragment from which a cause of death could be established. All that remained of two people were micro-traces in the apartment and the buckwheat. The investigative team went to the Preobrazhenko landfill. The Ekologia operator pulled GPS tracker data from the garbage trucks. Every vehicle was tracked. They identified the exact days the waste was collected from the containers on Vilonovskaya and Sadovaya. They determined the routes and calculated the approximate offloading zones at the landfill. They began to dig. Every day, 15 people, 3 excavators, 2 trucks, a bulldozer, and a loader were on site. Waste from the surveyed areas was moved to a separate platform and checked by hand. A winter landfill, tons of compressed trash, cold, and the smell. They worked for weeks. After the first week, a law enforcement source told journalists that bones were found in one of the bags. They were checked. They were not human. The search continued for months. Hundreds of people went through this work. The result? 0. Not a bone fragment, not a tooth, not a single identifiable remains. In August 1925, it was announced that the landfill had reached its operational limit. The operator applied to the environmental regulator to remove the site from the registry. Closure was set for January 1, 1926, followed by land reclamation. This effectively meant one thing: the remains of Viktor and Natalia Tarkov will likely never be found. They cannot be buried. A full forensic exam is impossible. It is impossible to establish the exact cause and circumstances of what happened in the Vilonovskaya apartment. The only things the investigation had at that point were the micro-traces in the bathroom, tissue fragments on the walls, and the testimony of the accused, who was still silent. While excavators were digging at the landfill, the investigation was reconstructing another chronology. the financial one. It was revealed that throughout January, Belskaya was not just performing a masquerade, she was methodically liquidating the property of her grandmother and grandfather. First went the icon collection. Next were jewelry items, rings, chains, ornaments belonging to her grandmother. Then her grandfather's Toyota RAV4, valued at about $2.5 million. To sell the car, she forged a power of attorney and posted an advertisement. According to some reports, even earlier, she sold a boat without permission. All at once, selling, re-registering, answering calls. Another detail. Shortly before her arrest, Belskaya searched the internet for information on crossing the border into Georgia via the Verkhny Lars checkpoint. Apparently, she was considering leaving the country. The investigation opened additional cases for theft of property, but profit as the sole motive didn't quite fit. The icons, the car, the jewelry. It was money, but not the kind of sums for which people commit such acts. There was much more at stake. A stake in a company, a business, assets. To reach those, one needs more than a power of attorney, one needs an inheritance. And for an inheritance, a person must be officially declared deceased. But for such a plan, money alone isn't enough. Something in this family had been very wrong long before that winter. Viktor Tarkov had one daughter, Lyudmila. In December 2022, a Samara court sentenced her to 7 years in a general regime colony for extortion, demanding 200 million rubles from a regional deputy, Alexander Maliv. The scheme was straightforward. From late 2020 to May 2021, Lyudmila, along with an unidentified accomplice, gathered compromising material on the deputy. Mileyev pretended to agree to pay, but contacted the FSB. On July 12, 2021, Lyudmila went to collect the money and was detained on the spot. She did not admit guilt, claiming there was no extortion, and she simply wanted to recover her father's debt. According to her version, in 2013, Tarkov had given Mileyev $2.5 million at 20% interest, and the deputy supposedly never returned the money. The court did not accept this version, and the regional court upheld the sentence. In February 2026, the court denied a petition to reduce her term. By the time of her arrest, Lyudmila Tarkova was well known in certain Samara circles. Acquaintances described her bluntly. Money meant everything to her. Ekaterina's father is an even more ambiguous figure. According to some reports, it is Sergei Loganov, a man with a criminal record known as __, quote, _11____. His charges included theft of petroleum products and possession of substances. Other reports name Konstantin Shcherbakov, a member of a local group who did not live past 2002. Ekaterina grew up in an environment where her grandfather led the city and the oil business. Her mother blackmailed deputies, and her father, whoever he was, had direct ties to the criminal world. But she had her own story and her own grievances against her grandparents. Ekaterina married in Cyprus to Vladislav Pasik, an entrepreneur from Israel. In 2018, their son Maur was born. However, 3 years after the birth, the arguments began. Belskaya returned to Samara and secretly took her son, cutting off all communication. Pasik would later state on a talk show that the Tarkov family simply stole his child. He didn't fight from Israel, married a second time, but did a DNA test just in case. Maur was his son. During the divorce, Ekaterina was awarded 15 million rubles. The money arrived, but she couldn't manage it. Her grandmother, Natalia Ivanovna, managed everything. She raised Maur and controlled every cent. According to media reports, the reason was simple. Belskaya suffered from an addiction, and she wasn't trusted with expenses. The grandmother went even further. According to several sources, Natalia Tarkova planned to go to court to have her granddaughter declared legally incompetent and strip her of parental rights. Acquaintances told journalists she demanded the money, and when she didn't get what she wanted, she began to threaten. She didn't want to work and expected to be supported. When the support stopped, she turned to pressure. The addiction started early. A former classmate, blogger Natalia Shiryaeva, told the press that even at 16, Belskaya drank, smoked, and looked down on everyone. She added, I always felt sorry for her. I knew she would grow into a monster, like anyone who isn't raised but is showered with money. It got worse with age. Acquaintances spoke of prohibited substances, some mentioned gambling. Her mother, Lyudmila, filed a lawsuit from the colony to have her daughter's legal capacity restricted, but the court did not hear the case. At the time of her arrest, Belskaya had accumulated debts of 705,000 rubles. She didn't work, but it was never enough. And at some point, her own son became a tool for pressure. Talk show host Andrei Malakov reported that Ekaterina dropped a hot hookah on Mayor and sent photos of the bandaged burns to her grandparents from the hospital. The message was simple: give me money or I won't treat him. The addiction required funds, debts grew, and control tightened. She found her own way out of this spiral. For almost a month after her arrest, Belskaya remained silent. She used her right against self-incrimination and didn't utter a word. Investigators worked without her: cameras, purchases, biological material, taxi routes. The evidence was mounting. Then, on February 28th, she spoke. The investigative committee published the statement that same day. Acting out of greed to seize relatives' property, she poisoned them, then used nitrogen for preservation, after which a male accomplice processed the remains, which they then distributed in trash containers. Here, the word man was heard for the first time. Belskaya named an accomplice, an acquaintance who had left the Samara region. According to her, she carried out the initial act, and he did the rest. The investigative committee immediately put him on the wanted list. In the video of the reconstruction, Belskaya appeared calm. Psychologist Gevorkyan, analyzing the recording, noted that she gave the impression of someone feeling relief, as if she no longer had to hide anything. 3 weeks of silence, followed by a sudden detailed account. According to specialists, this behavior could have been part of a pre-planned defense strategy. She was ordered a psychological and psychiatric evaluation. Simultaneously, a second case was opened for fraud involving the car. Greed was the official motive, but the further the investigation went, the less that term explained. The meeting happened in Georgia. Ekaterina went on vacation, and there, Svetlana Mitrivelli entered her life, a woman whose biography is hard to fit into one sentence. At various times, she introduced herself as Natella Benua, Mila Möller, even Princess Bagrationi. In 1995, she led a group that sold 26,000 tons of non-existent oil to Americans for nearly 7 billion rubles. In 1987, she helped her mother deal with the consequences of what happened to her father. Investigator Babilayev, who worked on the Mitrivelli case in the 90s, later stated that Tarkov might have known Svetlana from oil circles, but for Ekaterina, she became a mentor. She listened, gave advice, filled the void, and then introduced her to a psychic named Zenaida who supposedly saw the past and future. Consultations became regular, and then money was needed. Next, Mitrivelli began to tighten the noose. According to Belskaya, Svetlana allegedly sold her own workshop and mortgaged property, all supposedly for Katya's sake. When the debt became insurmountable, the demands changed. Mitrivelli moved from money to the Tarkovs' property. Ekaterina replied it was impossible. They were alive and wouldn't sign anything over. Then Mitrivelli suggested another option. Zenaida has a liquid that suppresses the will. Just add it, and they will sign anything. Everyone stays alive. That was how it was said, but it turned out differently. Svetlana sent her nephew, 25-year-old Dmitry Mitrivelli. Born in Tbilisi, he was reportedly a medical student. He arrived in Samara in the winter. Neighbors remembered him as Ekaterina's business partner. According to Belskaya's version, the poisoning happened in 2 stages. First, the tincture Svetlana sent from Georgia, supposedly to suppress the will. It didn't work. Then Dmitry brought tablets, and Ekaterina swapped them with their blood pressure medication. For several days, the Tarkovs took these, thinking they were their usual medicine. Near the New Year holidays, the grandfather could no longer get up. The grandmother held out longer, still going outside. And that's when Dmitry stepped in. At night, he entered the apartment and hid on the balcony, and when the grandmother grew weak, he emerged. What happened next, Ekaterina described in fragments. During the reconstruction, she pointed, quote, 16. She claimed she didn't know the substance was fatal, that Svetlana promised everyone would survive, but the investigation assigned the roles differently. According to the investigative committee, Dmitry and Ekaterina acted in concert, and Svetlana coordinated everything by phone from abroad. The question of who was the puppet and who was the puppeteer remained open. After 8 months in detention, in October 25th, Belskaya gave her first television interview. Malakov's film crew came to the prison. There, she spoke a phrase that divided the audience. Quote 17. Her version by then looked very different from the February confession. She claimed Dmitry acted in the apartment while she didn't realize where it was leading. According to her, after her grandparents stopped showing signs of life, Dmitry gave her wine, followed by assault, compromising photos, and blackmail. She claimed she simply had no choice. Belskaya also hinted she might know where the remains could be. In June 25th, the investigation detained another figure, 78-year-old Taisia Kiseleva-Mitrivelli, Svetlana's mother. Some viewers believed she was used, others did not. A month of masquerading with messages didn't fit well with the image of a terrified victim, but the only people who could confirm or deny her words, Svetlana and Dmitry Mitrivelli, were outside of Russia. In May 25th, the investigation finally named them. Dmitry Mitrivelli, indictment in absentia, arrest warrant, international search. Dmitry's photo was taken from Kuramash airport cameras, a winter jacket, passport, and ticket in hand, black bag on his shoulder. Both were in Georgia. It was impossible to interrogate them or confront Belskaya with them. The psychiatric evaluation found her sane. The charges: a double crime motivated by greed and large-scale fraud. The maximum penalty exceeds 20 years. Mayor was left without a mother. According to available data, he was in a facility for minors. His mother, Lyudmila, is in a colony, his grandparents are gone, and his father is in Israel. The entire family that could have taken him was either behind bars or abroad, and the question that started it all remains unanswered. Why? The answer is not just one word, it's an environment where money replaced relationships. A grandfather, a man of power and capital, a mother behind bars for trying to extort $200 million, a father outside the country. Criminal psychologist Yuri Antonyan, analyzing the case, suggested the accused might have hated the elder Tarkovs since early childhood, because a dominant grandmother, in his view, likely didn't give her what every child needs. Then came the control, which for someone with an addiction and debts was a strangulation. And finally, the Mitrivelli noose, the psychic, the debt trap, other people's mortgaged apartments. At that point, the only way out was the elderly couple's property. But after everything, the messages on behalf of those gone, the sale of icons, the forged documents, there was no pause, no hesitation. And then to the camera, quote 18 3 faces, the obedient victim of manipulation, the cold-blooded executor, the broken heiress. Which one is real, perhaps even she doesn't know. And that is the true horror of this story. Not the method, but the fact that the Mitrivellis are on the run, and the only person who knows the full truth is in a cell, changing her story.